You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is the illustrious Chelsea Fagan. Chelsea is an author and the founder and CEO of The Financial Diet, the largest women's personal finance media company. You may know her written work from her numerous nonfiction books or her pieces in publications like The Atlantic, Vice, and Cosmpolitan. But we're here to talk about Chelsea's fiction debut, A Perfect Vintage. Leah is an industrious American charged with overseeing the renovation of a chateau in the Loire Valley. Her meticulous plans start to go awry the moment her best friend invites herself along. But the story really kicks up once Leah meets the much younger son of the boss. A Perfect Vintage doesn't shy away from real-world issues or a sexy, sultry love scene. So, please allow me to introduce Chelsea Fagan, author of A Perfect Vintage. Hello, Chelsea. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for having me.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. So I'm Chelsea Fagan. I am the co-founder and CEO of The Financial Diet, which is a financial media company based here in Manhattan. And I am also an author. I've written several books, and I have my first fiction book coming out in June called A Perfect Vintage.
Very exciting. And that's what we're going to talk about. What is your connection to Paris or to France?
So I lived in Paris for several years. It's where I met my husband. I actually have been speaking French most of my life. My dad's side of the family is French Canadian, so I have a lot of French speakers in my family. And so I learned at a pretty young age. And I moved over to France. I was initially an au pair there in Paris. And then I started writing full time. And then I just lived in Paris as a freelance writer for a few years before my husband and I moved back to, my now husband and I moved back to New York.
Do you think you'd ever come back?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. So we visit a lot. We spend a lot of each year in France because he is French, so his family is over there. But they're actually we do visit Paris a fair amount. We're going for a couple weeks in June because we have friends and a little bit of family there. But most of his family actually lives right on the Spanish border. They live in the very southwest, very close to Barcelona. So I think eventually I'd like to move back to Europe or live there part of the year, but we would probably live in Spain just to because honestly, I say this, wearing a turtleneck in May, which is so unusual for New York. It's usually quite hot by this time. But as much as I love Paris and I do, the weather there is a little tough for me. I'm more of a warm weather girl.
I will not disagree with you. It is warm today in Paris, but I feel like it also could rain any second. So this will for sure for me be the farthest north I ever live. So can you tell us a little bit about what A Perfect Vintage is about?
Definitely. So, it is a romance novel, but I would say it's as much like a character study of the protagonist. She's a woman in her later 30s who is single, doesn't have children, doesn't want them, and is really aggressively career-oriented. She goes into, so a lot of people may not know, but in France and in other European countries, there are a lot of these old dilapidated properties that have been in families for a really long time. Often families will inherit these properties. Maybe they're former nobility. They can be land rich and title rich, but not have a lot of cash on hand to take care of them. So a lot of them fall into disrepair and a lot of them are abandoned or not lived in very often. So her work is that she goes into these properties and turns them into boutique hotels and full service vineyards and all of that kind of stuff. And she ends up having to take her best friend / cousin and her niece on this one particular trip because of an event in their lives. And they arrive at the chateau for the summer where she's working, and all kinds of hijinks and a love story kind of ensues. She falls for one of the sons of her boss, who's 12 years younger than her.
Fabulous. Now, you mentioned this is not your first book, but it is your first fictional book. What inspired you to venture into fiction?
I read a lot of romance novels during the pandemic because my husband had to leave the country for a few years during the pandemic because of immigration issues. So we were separated for long stretches of time. And also, the world was in a really bad place. So like a lot of people, I was just very upset all the time. And I really just wanted to just kind of find an escape that felt a little bit more productive than watching a lot of reality TV, which I also did. And I really just enjoyed the books, and I fell in love with a few of them in particular. And I had a feeling of like, hey, I'd like to try this. And, I have a 4-day work week at my job. I don't have children and don't want them. So I have a fair amount of free time. So I just decided, why not? Let's do it.
I love that. I do think that creating your own chateau in the south of France is not a bad way to escape during the middle of a pandemic.
Exactly.
Was this an idea that you had gestating for a long time?
No, but it's very much drawn from things in my own life. My husband's family works, not his parents, but one side of his family. They're farmers and wine producers. And so I've been with my husband for 12 years. So through the years, I've kind of learned a lot about that stuff. So I had a lot of points of reference. And I also, I have been to a lot of these types of properties throughout the years and kind of am familiar with a lot of the kind of day-to-day goings on and how they function and things like that. So it just felt like the kind of story. Ultimately, most romance novels boil down to a love story. So, what happens around it and the context in which it happens is kind of, you can make it whatever you want to be. But ultimately, I was like, okay, well, I know the kind of love story I want to write. And then beyond that, I just feel like I have an interesting enough setting for it. So,
yeah. So let's talk about the chateau. This chateau, which is the central location for the book, is it based on an actual place that you know, or is it one that you dreamed up?
So it is based on one that I know. But so the book takes place in the Loire Valley, which is actually like north central. Well, it's like central France, which I have been to, but the chateau that I like and was always picturing is one in Burgundy, which I spent like a week or so in a couple years ago, where we did just like a couple of chateau wine tour type things. And, in the book, a lot of it kind of has to do with her desire to make a lot of sort of aesthetic and branding choices that the family doesn't agree with, or that certain members of the family don't agree with. And that is actually, I think, one of the more interesting to me, not necessarily, to me, it's interesting in the book, but I think it's also interesting generally, like the sort of battle in France around tourism and what the image of France is supposed to be, and how often, France it's the largest tourist market in the world. It's the most touristed country in the world. I believe Paris is the most touristed city. It's a huge part of their economy. The wine business is a huge part of their economy. And they have, I think, a huge cultural and economic imperative to keep a very specific image of France and to keep a very specific experience for people who come visit, because they want, the people who visit to feel like it matches up with the expectations that come from the media they consume and the books and the movies. And it sort of becomes a vicious cycle because, the media that's created about France is very white. It's very old fashioned. It's a very specific aesthetic. It's a very specific, homogenous culture. And even though that's not at all an accurate portrayal of the country now. And so people come with that expectation. So the tourism industry, I think, feels that it has to live up to that expectation. So for example, the chateau that we stayed in Burgundy was hyper traditional and kind of, in my opinion, stiflingly so. And I have very rarely visited any kind of, outside of Paris, any kind of venue like that was not extremely traditional in the way that it was not just designed, but also presented. And so I think the question of, someone wanting to present a very, very different image and not being French, because the protagonist is not French, would have maybe more of a willingness to do that. That was also something that I really wanted to dive into, because it is a really big issue in France.
It's really interesting. I think you're absolutely right. I do feel like people tend to lean into these really old antique-y kind of things, which feel stodgy, or it goes too far the other way where it's like hyper minimalist spa kind of white wall thing. And that doesn't feel authentic either. So I loved being a part of the aesthetic choices that you made. And because Leah is renovating the chateau, we're really privy to a lot of those details, a lot of the selections that she makes. And we learned a lot about her aesthetic and the decor and the decorations and the design and all that. Are her aesthetics the same as your aesthetics?
Well, I mean, she has an unlimited budget. And
well, sure.
No, in the sense that, I mean, my aesthetic is pretty feminine. Like, I like things to be kind of girly and, a lot of color, a lot of trinkets and things like that. And ultimately, on some level, of course, there are similarities with my protagonist, but she's definitely a much more kind of stoic and on some level masculine person than I am. I think has a very kind of a much harsher energy and also a much more pared down aesthetic. Quite frankly, what I consume a lot of professional interior designers on social media. I like to see what they're doing. And I think, they have absolutely excellent taste, but especially if you're working in hotels, there's an anonymity to it. There's a perfection to it. I wanted her design taste to be sort of a reflection of herself in the sense that it is perfectly good taste, but almost a little too perfect. And there isn't enough margin for error and for fun, which I like to have in my own life. I'm a much more loosey-goosey person.
That makes sense to me. I can see that. And so one of the things that you talk a lot about in the book, and one of the things that I read on your profile, that you are an avid home cook. Is this correct?
Yes.
So you talk a lot about food in the book. And I think any book set in France has to talk a lot about food. But the food that you mention isn't like traditional French food. We're not getting boeuf bourguignon and confit de canard and things like that. And one of the characters talks about why that choice is. But why was it important for you to include the dishes that you did?
Obviously, anyone who lives in France, who spends a lot of time in France, knows how substantial and important and influential the Middle Eastern and North African communities are in France. In my particular case, my husband, one side of his family is Pied Noir. So they lived in North Africa for a very long time. A lot of members of the family are North African. And especially in the southwest of France in particular, which is not where this takes place, but is where I'm most familiar with outside of Paris, like it's just such an ambient part of the culture and such a wonderful part about being there. I mean, for me, I'm almost as much, if not more excited when I go to France to know that I'll get really amazing Middle Eastern and North African food, which I just really love and my husband really loves. So I wanted that to be not just a representation of my experience, but also a representation of ultimately the protagonist, her effect on this project outside of, the love story is she's really sort of moving this family, which is in many ways very traditional and very old school, into the future. And I also wanted to show, and this is something that happens in America too, but there are a lot of Middle Eastern and North African characters of different generations. And I wanted to show the kind of relationship that different generations have. For example, being really upfront about cooking their own food and exerting their influence. The older characters are much more conservative about, I'm going to cook French food and I want to be as French as possible and not fall into any stereotypes about being the couscous place on the corner, which is like something that I think a lot of people are very sensitive about. Whereas younger generations, I think are, at least when I think of my friends, are just much more unencumbered about expressing their culture and their food and not feeling that they have to subsume it into an idea of what it means to be French. So I just really wanted to kind of explore that because it's such a huge part of my experience of France. And I think for the vast majority of people who live or spend time in France, it's theirs as well. It's just not something that necessarily always gets exported in media and in tourism.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think when I go out with my friends, we almost exclusively go to places that are not traditionally French because it's like French food is everywhere. And, at a certain point, you want just something else. You want some other flavors. You want some other cuisine. And coming from New York myself, where you can basically visit a different country every day, it's becoming more like that here. And I really appreciate it. And I liked seeing that reflected in your book. Was there one dish in particular in the book that's something that you make yourself?
I would say I've made a lot of the dishes. At one point, the chef makes couscous croquettes. And I love making, anytime, like risotto, you make arancini, polenta, you make like polenta fries and stuff like that. And I love just like over making any kind of batch of starchy food and then making it into essentially fried balls the next day. So that's definitely something I've done quite a bit.
Sounds amazing. Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So one of the prominent relationships in this book is between Leah and Stephanie, who are technically cousins, but they're really more like sisters or best friends. And Leah is 36. She's career-driven and childless. And Stephanie is 44. She's divorcing and she has a kid. And these contrasts come up a lot in conversations. They come up a lot in Leah's head, who's the person we're living with the most. And a lot of these conversations revolve around life purpose and values and who is a more like legitimate authority when it comes to certain matters. Why was it important for you to include this dynamic?
Because I have experienced this dynamic a lot in my life, and I think most women have. They are somewhat binary in a lot of their life choices and a lot of their relationships to money, to power, to a sense of duty and obligation. The catalyst for Stephanie joining on this trip is that she is finally divorcing a husband who's been very controlling and emotionally abusive and has especially, and this is a huge part of the storyline, has financially kind of abused and controlled her for their whole marriage. And I've read in some of the reviews that people have been giving that the choices that each woman makes as far as how she finds security is probably the most striking difference between them, because Leah's choice has always been, I'm going to be as independent as possible financially, have everything totally under my own control, never let anyone else kind of affect it. But she also does come from financial privilege, which Stephanie does not. So Stephanie entered into a position where she had someone essentially taking care of her. And I think in both cases in life, people on either side of that binary, people who have kind of outsourced their financial security versus people who have it under total control, but have made other sacrifices, and people who come from privilege versus people who don't. I think there can be a lot of sensitivity, a lot of judgment, a lot of kind of mutual misunderstanding between those types of people. And that's obviously compounded by one has children, one doesn't want them. One was married, one's never been in a relationship at that level. I think, these kinds of choices and how they naturally push women apart over the years is something that I personally experience. I know a lot of women can relate to that. Loving someone and wanting to be in their life and wanting to stay close to them despite these natural divergences, I think is a very real issue. But I also think in terms of finances, it is very difficult, I think, for a person who is fiercely independent to see a person who's maybe making not great financial choices and to release the need to intervene or to judge or to try and solve the problem for them. And that's something that they go through quite a bit. And honestly, and I hate to sound cynical about it, but I think in the case of Stephanie, who is I would say the second most prominent character, a lot of times in narratives when, this is a woman who has been in an abusive marriage, who's had her money controlled, who's never been independent since she's basically been an adult, we would want to read a story where she gets free, she saves up her money, she becomes this really independent woman. The truth is and this is the work that I do at the Financial Diet, that is not how it works for the vast majority of women because the vast majority of women do not control their long-term finances in marriages, even if it's not an abusive marriage, that's just not how it shakes out in most marriages. And most women in marriages do not control their long-term finances until the case of divorce or death of a spouse. And when you think about what a lot of those women are doing, yes, some of them do become fiercely independent after and kind of take ownership, but a lot of them do what the character of Stephanie does, which is find another person to continue that dynamic with. And, you know, on some level, I really wanted to show that because it is a real phenomenon. And although it may not be the most satisfying or happy ending, I think it's important to see like, this is how it often works in the real world. And a person can still be worthy and powerful and interesting and lovable, even if they're not necessarily always making the right choices.
Yeah, very interesting. This is a very richly aesthetic book. And so it's very easy to picture the chateau and the grounds and the food and the fashion. And then when we get to the romance, this is a very sexy, steamy little book. Did you have any misgivings about writing about sex?
No, I mean, first of all, I've read a lot of romance books, and trust me, mine is child's play compared to a lot of them. But I would say no, because, you know, I'm 34. I've been married for 12 years. The jig is up. Like, I think everyone's probably aware that I know what sex is. But more importantly, I mean, my work with the financial diet is, you know, for me, it was always about kind of removing the taboo from talking about money and being unashamed and unencumbered about it. And I wanted to, not that I think I needed to, I mean, a lot of women have already broken down that barrier, but I wanted for me, sex is part of life, as one of the characters says in the book, but sex is part of life. And I didn't want to have, like, if I was going to write a story about the human experience, to me, the human experience includes sex. And if I, at my age, and the place that I am in my career and in my life, am not comfortable addressing that, then I don't know, then that's a me problem. And I wanted to get over it, but it was fine. I also have very cool parents and family. I don't have a lot of like, you know, really uptight people in my life. So it was always like, my dad's not reading it, thank God, but everyone's always been very supportive.
Fabulous. Yeah, I appreciated the way that you wrote about it, because I feel like when you read about sex and foreplay and physical intimacy in books, it becomes one of two ways. Either it's very euphemistic and it's like members going into gardens and things like that, or it becomes very crass and about the physical act. And your writing was much more sensorial and about the feelings, which I appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Did you have any challenges in striking the right tone when it came to this physical intimacy, foreplay writing?
I edited it a lot. I also worked with both a structural and a line editor. So I got to have, you know, a lot of input as far as, you know, what was working and what wasn't. I ended up scaling it back a bit in the final edit, making it a bit more reserved, because I think, not because I felt like, oh, I can't write about that stuff, but I personally always feel, so again, I read a lot of romance novels, and sometimes when the sex scenes are very heavy on the page, I actually find myself kind of skimming them. I don't enjoy like super, super detailed stuff, especially with like a lot of like really like anatomical terms and things like that. And I actually find that what is more interesting is the lead up. It's the stolen glances. It's the suggestiveness. It's yearning. It's anticipation. And I actually, like, what I wanted to create with the book was more a sense of ambient eroticism. Like, you know, because when you're falling in love or when you're really attracted to someone, it's not just about sex. It's like food tastes better, music sounds better. You're much more aware of your surroundings. You feel your clothes on your body in a different way. And it's all, everything's heightened. And sex is part of that. But I think also when it comes to the experience of reading or consuming media, it's like everything kind of leading up to and surrounding it is the more interesting place to work in.
I agree. And I think you do a really wonderful job of that. And, you know, I feel the same way that sometimes when it comes to the sex scenes, it's almost jarring and I find myself pulled out of it because it becomes quite obvious that it's happening to these characters and not in my mind anymore. And I felt always still engaged in what was happening in your pages. So
thank you.
One of the things that a number of your readers pointed out was the inclusion of Leia's psychologist and this open discussion of mental health and the need for this kind of self-care. Why did you decide to include this?
Well, I mean, I've been to therapy and it has been very helpful to me at different times in my life. But also, I mean, you know, when I put this book out, I knew off the bat that some people would be turned off by it because ultimately my protagonist is in some ways unlikable, is in some ways a bitch, and not for everyone, not to everyone's taste. And I think one of the things that does sometimes frustrate me in genre fiction that I enjoy more about literary fiction is I think in genre fiction, there's often less of a space for characters to actually be problematic, like to do and think and experience things that are on a real level messed up. And luckily it hasn't been many, but I have had a few people that was like, this character is a bad person. I don't think that she is, but I also think that the whole point of the story for her is that she does change in a really meaningful way. And for a lot of people, therapy is a part of that process, and it is for her. But I thought to myself, like, if I'm going to do a genre fiction book, which already has some level of expectation that your protagonist should be someone that you pretty unilaterally root for, which is a tall order, I think, because most people are not someone that you could totally root for in a 360 way or totally relate to, which I think that's the other thing that a lot of people don't necessarily like, is when they don't feel that they can totally relate to them. But that if I was going to have a character who actually does messed up things, who is mean sometimes, who speaks to people in ways that I think a lot of people would not like, that she also has to be at least aware of that and attempting to work on it and able to suss out when she's, making good versus bad decisions in that regard. So in some ways, although it does definitely serve the plot and character development, it was also at least an attempt to demonstrate through the book that, yes, she's a problematic person, but she's aware of that and trying to improve.
It's really interesting when you say that. I don't think she's a bad person either, but I think this is just occurring to me now, but the moments that maybe I'm less inclined to root for her, I'm more inclined to root for Theo. So it still keeps the romance alive because I still want him to get what he wants,
Yes, totally.
Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris Estate of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I think it would be really fabulous if we could hear a little bit from the book.
Sure, I would be happy to. So I'll just tee it up. So this scene is, Leah has just thrown a tasting dinner to show off the chef that she has picked for the hotel restaurant. It's gone very, very well. And the chef is named Caroline, and she has cooked this whole meal. Leah has organized this very elaborate day. It's all gone very well. She's feeling relieved. Up to this point, she has been harboring a very intense attraction to Theo, which she assumes is completely unreciprocated because of his age, because of the fact that, her niece also likes him quite a bit, and because she has a pretty low opinion of herself. So this is the scene after, as the dinner's wrapping up, she's in the kitchen helping clean up. And we have the first more explicit interaction between our two main love interests. Caroline dashed out of the kitchen, heading up the stairs. Leah immediately set herself to being useful, loading a few plates into one of the dishwashers and wiping down a counter. She felt the easy, generous relaxation that can only come from everything going exactly to plan and knowing that she didn't have anything left to prove. And the generous wine pairing she'd finally indulged in didn't hurt either. Hey, I can do that. A deep, gentle voice came from behind her, just inside the kitchen doorway. Theo. Oh, hi. Leah set down the platter she was rinsing and gave her best attempt at a casual smile. It's really no problem, but honestly, neither of us needs to be doing this. We paid the catering team to clean up for the evening, and whatever isn't finished, Marie and I will handle in the morning. He walked the pitcher that he had brought with him over to the large double sink where Leah was standing, turning the faucet toward himself and filling it with cold water. Given that this was something that the waiters were already doing at regular intervals, it seemed like a bit of a pretense, a thought that she banished as soon as it involuntarily arose in her mind. You don't have to do that either. This evening is properly staffed, she laughed nervously. He looked at her over the top of his rimless, rounded glasses, bent over slightly as he required to comfortably use the sink, a single curl moving into his line of sight. I like to be useful. I feel like we've been over this. Well, I do too. That's why I'm holding down the kitchen while Caroline takes care of something. Why did she clarify that Caroline wasn't coming back right away? That's nice of you. He paused, standing up to lean against the counter where his towering height felt slightly less intimidating. I actually have been wanting to tell you something while we're here. Leah braced herself, feeling her pulse quicken and her stomach drop slightly. She had no idea what he wanted to say, and it filled her with a nervous, fluttering energy. You did a really good job yesterday. The compliment in this context felt so intense that Leah could only swerve out of its way. Oh, yeah, Remy can make anyone look good. He raised an elegant hand to his mouth and pursed his lips closed with a single finger, appraising her, remaining silent until she spoke again. Well, and I had been preparing for a while. It's one of my tentpole activities. Seemingly satisfied with her acknowledgement of his kindness, he moved on. And the way you've been handling my brother, especially yesterday, has been really admirable. I know better than anyone how difficult he can be, and it takes a lot of strength not to let him get into your head or stoop to his level. He kept her gaze in a way that felt distinctly related to Gabrielle. They were both from a noble family who inherited confidence like they inherited tennis skills after all, but his stare felt more respectful, pleading almost. Oh, she near whispered, struggling to find her footing. I deal with opinionated people on these jobs all the time. I get it. He looked at her curiously before gently shaking his head. Not like my brother. I know how wrong what he says to you is. Leah looked down at her hands, turning her bracelet as she brought herself to respond. Well, it wouldn't be professional for me to confirm or deny that, but thank you. She re-met his gaze, smiling gently and feeling her confidence. You're welcome, he returned her smile. Honestly, we really didn't even think he was going to be here this summer. Really? Leah's heart nearly stopped at the possibility of real, useful Gabrielle gossip. Yeah, he's had a rough couple of years since Mom died. He hasn't been himself. The euphemistic phrase was paired with the kind of expression that indicated real trouble. I see. Leah strove to say as little of substance as possible. Well, that can happen. He's not a bad person. He just can't get out of his own way. I know some people like that. She could have been referring to any number of family members, but on some level, she meant herself. But you don't deserve to get the brunt of his bullshit just because you're great at this job and he isn't. Leah felt a warm, expansive joy move through her chest at his kind words and found herself leaning further into him, their arms close as they both leaned them against the counter, her with her back firmly to the sink and him cheating in toward her slightly, almost enveloping her with his stature. Thank you, she barely managed to reply. Did you like the food? I loved it, especially that paella. He laughed quietly, glancing down at his own hand, now inches from hers on the counter. But I felt like an animal scraping rice off the bottom of the pan. That's what you're supposed to do. If you don't look at least somewhat deranged when eating a paella, that means it wasn't good. Did I look deranged? You looked hungry, she offered sincerely, feeling herself pulse with attraction at just how hungry he looked at that very moment. That sounds like a nice word for deranged. His eyes were close enough now that she could see every band of color, even in the dimmed light, the blues, the greens, the lavender grays. He continued, his voice dropping to a lower, more conspiratorial tone. You know, as he spoke, Caroline ran back into the kitchen, shouting a moment-shattering, I'm back, in a sing-song voice. Turning the corner to their line of sight, she stopped herself short as her face fell into a light expression of embarrassment. I'm sorry, am I interrupting? No, Leah clarified a little too sharply. We're just going over something from the other day. Should we help you bring the desserts out? Oh, no, don't worry, Caroline assured, gesturing for them to return to the table. You've done more than enough. Before they could make their exit, though, a notably tipsy Alain bounded into the kitchen from the patio, winding up one of the disposable cameras for another photo. Let's go, he chirped, raising the camera to his eye. Photo time, the three of you. Caroline moved over to the two of them by the counter, and Leah opened a wide space for her to stand between them so that she would not be pressed against Théo. Caroline settled in, and Leah and Théo placed their hands behind her, closing in around her and saying Hotel Chateau Victoire on Alain's command as he took the photo. Leah felt the air vanish from her lungs as the tiny camera clicked and the little flashbulb popped. Théo's long fingers had migrated to an unmistakable resting place on the small of her back, bearing down with the gentlest pressure as if to be exploring the topography of her body. Leah instinctually leaned back into it, pressing her spine further into his palm, offering up more of the region to canvas. Alain implored them to stay put for another photo, winding up the little camera before she could protest. They smiled again, Leah willing herself to seem casual when every nerve in her body felt electrified from within. The room seemed to move in slow motion around her, Caroline bounding forward to take the camera from Alain, and Théo following immediately after as Leah remained frozen in place, skin burning through her blouse at the exact spot where his hand had been.
Beautiful, thank you. Will there be a French version of this book?
Maybe. I'm working with my agent now on the international rights. We've had a lot of inquiries, including from France. I think probably yes, but it will just be a little bit later in the year.
Okay. So what's next for you? Will there be another romance book in your horizons?
Probably. But for now, it's just like focusing so much on this. I have to do, the events, and I have a lot of marketing stuff coming up. And yeah, I'm just, for now, it's one of those things where I just can't let myself see beyond the horizon of this book of mental health.
I understand that. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing and how this book is doing and whatever else is coming up for you?
So I am at Fagan Chelsea on Instagram and TikTok. I sort of stopped using Twitter, so I don't really post there anymore. But you can also go to aperfectvintagebook.com, and it has everything, including you can buy prints of the cover art, which is an original oil painting I commissioned for the book. There's the playlist, which is awesome. There's lots of other cool stuff. So definitely check that out as well.
Thank you. So I will include show notes to all of that, links with everything so that people can find you really easily.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you again to Chelsea Fagan for such a scintillating conversation. You can find Chelsea on Instagram and Facebook at Fagan Chelsea, on Twitter at Chelsea_Fagan, and on her website, aperfectvintagebook.com. Please join me next week when my guest will be Jacqueline Goldis, author of The Chateau. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite authors who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.